Alright, so let's hope this is working. I'm not gonna show my face in this video, because I want to focus on my screen at hand. So, I've been trying to make this video all morning. I recorded a few other desktop environments, but decided that's not the way I wanted to go. So, today I wanted to talk to you about what distros I've used and why I ultimately settled on Linux Mint. Kind of give you guys a backstory into my experience with Linux. So growing up, I used Windows 95, I used Windows 98, I used Windows, I think it was ME or 2000, I don't remember what the fuck the name was, and I used Windows XP. I think my two favorite Windows was 98 and XP, honestly. And around the time Vista came out, I kind of realized Microsoft was heading in a weird direction where the Aero desktop that was implemented in Vista and also Windows 7, and why I ultimately hated fucking 7, was too GPU intensive. In other words, if you had a low-end computer, you really couldn't use Windows because your hardware just couldn't support it. This computer, for example, is a Dell Studio 1557. It has a first-gen i7, and let me pull up system info here, so you're not just staring at a screen. I can show you actually. And this has a RV710 graphics in it. Now, it's not the best. It takes about 12 hours to render a video sometimes if I'm taking 4K video and transcoding it to 1080p and doing like a 20-minute video. It takes about 12 hours to render. It's not the best computer. However, with Linux, it works. This laptop came with Windows 7. I have used Windows 7 on it, and I can tell you after 5 minutes of using Windows 7 on this, I literally have to force my computer off and rip the battery out because it overheats so badly. I mean, it gets really, really hot to the touch. Like, if you turn off your stove and let it sit for a couple minutes, like, yeah, it's not going to burn your hand, but it still hurts like hell. Like, that's how hot this laptop gets. So as you can see right here, I'm running Linux 19.3 Cinnamon. I've got kernel 5.5. I've got Cinnamon version 4.4.8. I manually, every other month, update my kernel to the latest, as well as sudo. Just because, the reason why I do the kernel is because it comes with a lot of new features that I like using. I think it's 5.4, or 5.0, I don't remember. One of those came, I think it's 5.4 actually. Yeah, it was 5.4. Made it so I didn't have to install a separate package. I could just put an SD card into my system and it would work. That's the reason why I recommend, if you're on a distro, to update your kernel to the latest, because it does come with some useful features. Now, around Vista, I switched to Linux, and that's not to say I never used Windows again. I did. I used XP from time to time. I used 7 here and there, but my main computer was always running Linux, and I started out with Debian. Debian was what I used, and Debian was great. It did everything I needed. I could look up stuff on the web, I could pirate music and shit like that, you know, basic shit you would do growing up. And I was born in 91, so internet wasn't that good. It was a little better by the time I was in high school. I wasn't like using the internet in the 80s, I'd imagine. I wasn't even around then, but I can only imagine how bad it was. But I always wanted to use Linux more and more. Now, around the time, I want to say about 7 years ago, my desktop finally died, and I didn't feel like getting a laptop, and, you know, at the time, all I was doing was looking up shit on the web and listening to music and stuff like that, and so I just used Android. That was my go-to for the longest time, because I didn't really need a computer. So it was Android tablets, Android phones, which Android is technically a Linux distro. I want to say about 4 years ago, not 4 years ago, maybe about 3 years ago, 2.5, 3 years ago, I got a laptop. And the problem is it's not like a desktop where you just plug in the shit. It's got Wi-Fi, it's got a touchpad and all this shit. In Debian, there's problems. You have to download the non-free version for it to even work. I put an Intel Wi-Fi 2x2 AC graphics card in this laptop too, by the way. And the reason why I did that is because Intel has the best compatibility for Wi-Fi cards in the first place. It's embedded right into the kernel. I don't have to install anything. But ultimately, I did distro hop quite a bit. I used about every flavor of Ubuntu, and I absolutely fucking hated most of them because of the shit Ubuntu pulls. They've never been a good distro in my opinion. They've always done something questionable. 1910, the last one they released, they basically dropped apt completely, and everything's just Snap now, which is their proprietary bullshit. And you know, it's shit like that that makes me hate Ubuntu. I did try, was it OpenSUSE? It wasn't too good, honestly. I tried Fedora. Now, Fedora is kind of hit or miss, because the biggest problem with Fedora is there's not enough packages. Coming from Debian, there's just so little packages, it's not something usable for me. It might be usable for you, that's fine. There's also tricks you have to go on, like GU, what was the name of it? So if we go to sound and video, this one right here, GUVCView, you have to go to their website and download the RPM file from the website like you would Windows. It's really a mess to use Fedora. I tried Manjaro, and I can never get that thing to fucking boot off a USB, only through a CD. And ultimately I settled on Linux Mint. 18.3 was what was out at the time, I believe. And what really took me to Linux Mint is having used Linux for the longest time and having gone through so many distros and desktop environments, I realized what I'm looking for is familiarity. If you're coming from Windows, you want things to look similar. But you also want to be able to customize it to the fullest. And you want it to be simple regardless. If you don't want it simple, fucking why? I'm also a very lazy person, and I like simplicity for simplicity's sake. Now, Mate is a continuation of GNOME 2, and does a lot right. I can right-click in the file manager and open up it as root, so I don't have to go into the terminal and command into a file. I don't have to move shit around in the terminal. I can just do it through the GUI, which is great. There's a lot of different desktop choices to choose from in Mate as well. I personally like the netbook look, although I have to do a lot of customization. But the problem with Mate is it doesn't look as polished as something like XFCE, for example. Now what I wish XFCE would do is, as you can see here, I have the icon and it's much more modern looking. Mate does do that, XFCE doesn't. And I think that's kind of the only problem I really have with XFCE. Other than that, and it looks very dated, it kind of looks like a more modern version of Windows 98, in my opinion. KDE looks like a fucking mess. The look isn't clean. They basically threw simplicity out the window. They threw everything but the kitchen sink at it. The menus aren't very good looking. You have 3 menu options in KDE. KDE Connect is kind of fucking stupid in my opinion, because it only goes over Wi-Fi, so if you're using a VPN, it's completely fucking useless. Meanwhile, you can just hook your phone up via Bluetooth and Bluetooth share, or you can just plug your phone into your laptop or desktop, whatever you're using, and just transfer the file that way. It's not. I'm not really sure why they made it. Um, and then modern GNOME 3, you have to install so many extensions to make it look nice. And even then, themes can break it. I've had many problems where I've installed a theme and it broke something. And so all these problems I have with desktop environments all come down to not just it's not what I'm used to, but because I can't customize it the way I want to. Whether it's GNOME because if I customize it the way I want to, it'll fucking break it, or if I update it, it might break because it's not officially supported by the people making the distro. It's 15 different people making different extensions. With KDE, there's only so much I can do to begin with. I don't know of any way to put a custom menu like you can GNOME 3. Arc menu is my favorite for GNOME 3, by the way. And then XFCE, yeah, sure, the menu is very nice. It's very customizable, and this thing right here isn't something I can really figure out how to do in XFCE, and it just looks dated. And Mate, while yes, I can kind of get it to look the way I want to, it looks even more dated and unpolished than XFCE. So for me, both KDE and GNOME are completely out of the question in terms of desktop environments, and so isn't Mate, simply because it's just too outdated of a look. So the only thing I would recommend is Cinnamon and XFCE for a desktop environment. But the only distro I've found that I enjoy using and has actually worked well is Linux Mint. Now, I have tried Pop! OS, and that does do a lot right, and they're continuing to do a lot right. But there's also a lot of fucking problems with it. Updating when the last version of Pop! OS came out, 1910, when I updated to then, I had to stop working in order to update it, just like you would in Windows. That is a fucking issue for me. I don't know if they've changed it since then. I couldn't tell you. I haven't used it since then. That was the last time I used it. Whereas with Linux Mint, I can update to the latest version while I'm working, and then I can restart whenever the fuck I feel like it. There are very few problems I've had with Mint, and usually it's something stupid like KTouch wasn't working because there was a program that needed to be installed. I recently had to reinstall my entire operating system because I was having a graphical error. But if I go into KTouch now, you don't even have to, I think I installed the Flatpak, by the way. You don't need that extra package, it just works now out the box. I don't know about GNOME Music, I haven't tried it again. But as you can see, it works fine. So I'm glad that's working now. The latest issue is the Bluetooth in the system tray keeps popping up even if I have the Blueberry applet installed. It's minor shit like that that doesn't really affect me, really. That goes wrong. That's easily fixable. It's not something like with Ubuntu where if I'm going to log into my computer, my password doesn't fucking work because the keyring doesn't work for some reason. And that's happened in every version of Ubuntu I've used, including Budgie, which Budgie was my favorite. Kind of wish Linux Mint would put Budgie as an option. If I'm being honest, Budgie is like my second favorite Linux distro. Although there is one key problem I have with Budgie, and that is the Raven menu that comes off the side. If you have your computer set up so the panel hides itself, the Raven menu overlaps and it kind of breaks it a little bit. And that's kind of annoying. Aside from that, Budgie's a great thing. But the problem I have with a lot of distros, especially KDE, is that they're just not simple to use. When you go into Linux Mint, and you go into settings here, this is the settings, it's very easy to use. You have your backgrounds, effects, themes, everything's here, and everything's very simple to use. It's just very simple. You can do traditional right, you can do Mac style left. So now it's over there. I don't know why I'd want that, but if you want that, that's cool. You don't have to install extensions and shit like you would in GNOME 3. You can just do this, so Alt-Tab. So to cover flow is this. I think I like timeline actually better. Yeah, let's go timeline. I have the Windows 7 style menu installed. So if we go to where's the applets here? You can just download, and there's your applets you can install. I have the Sin 7 start menu, which makes it look like Windows 7. You got Bluetooth, color, display, mouse. For example, I have my touchpad, so it's custom acceleration and sensitivity. It's very simplistic and very easy to use. If you put this on your system, whether you're an experienced user like myself who knows how to use the terminal somewhat efficiently, or if you're a new user, it's very easy to pick up and just run with it, really. And that is what I love most about Linux Mint, and what really comes out great about Linux Mint. It also has a lot of the video codecs out of the box. Now, I recently decided to try to make this video. I was going to show different desktop environments and decided against that, so all that's fucking gone. But I realized even the latest versions of Ubuntu don't have the video codecs necessary. If I record something in H.264 or whatever the fuck it's called, it doesn't play out of the box unless I install VLC. It just doesn't have those video codecs needed, whereas Linux Mint has them out of the box. As you can see here, this is how I have my theming set up. It has Mint X. They've focused more since 19 on Mint Y, so you have all this shit. And because the theme and the desktop environment are made by Linux Mint, you know that the theme isn't going to break the system. And that's ultimately why I gravitate, no matter what distro I try out, why I always gravitate back towards Linux Mint. Because it's just very simple to use, it's very well designed, and they're the ones making the desktop environment, they're the ones making the themes, so you know that it's going to work well. If you have a graphics tablet, there's that. You can turn on hot corners, startup applications, preferred applications, panel, date, time. It's just a very simple, well-made system. And it's only going to get better. So if we go to Linux Mint's website here, and we click on monthly news. So Linux Mint Debian Edition, that's what LMDE stands for. It's based off Debian instead of Ubuntu. A lot of the features that we've had in Linux Mint since 19, they're going to start adding. But that's not what I wanted to focus on. The next version of Cinnamon is going to make it easier for you to use multiple monitors that have different resolutions. It's also going to have fractional scaling. So instead of, as you can see here, at the moment the scaling is either 100% normal mode or 200% high DPI, so 4K displays and 1440. Going forward, the scaling will be able to be different for each monitor, and you'll be able to set it to values in between 100 and 200. What that means is Linux Mint is going to do what no other distro currently can, and that is if you have a 720p laptop hooked up to a 4K monitor, it'll be very easy to have both of those at the right resolution, at different refresh rates, and that's going to be great. That's basically all that's coming in that we know of so far. To change desktop background. Now, the desktop backgrounds aren't much to look at, I'll give you that, compared to some of the other distros. But overall, Linux Mint just is a very simple and easy to use. So if I wanted to move the panel, click there, and now it's up there. I could also move it to any side here if I wanted to. It's much more polished than XFCE or anything really, and Cinnamon is based off GNOME 3. So, this is kind of my point. While yes, it continues the feel of GNOME 2, it adds the polish of GNOME 3 without looking like a complete piece of shit like GNOME 3, where there's just so much removed from it, it's really not worth using it. If I go to music, for example, let's say I wanted to open as root. I just input my password, and I can do this anywhere in the file manager. Same thing as you would in Mate. And now this is elevated to root. So I can just move things in and out. So if I have to do that, I can. I don't have to use the terminal. For a first-time user coming from Windows, Linux Mint really is the default. In my opinion, it's the easiest to use. It has the most features out of the box. It's very simple. And it's just very easy to pick up and use. And it doesn't have a lot of the problems that Ubuntu has. It's very stable. Very few times have I had an issue with it, and usually the issues are not with Linux Mint, but with a piece of software not working properly, like KTouch, which is KDE's fault, or the system tray I'm having an issue with, but it's really not an issue. It's nothing that's going to break the system, and it's nothing like Ubuntu where if I go to log into my computer I can't, so now I have to grab my backups, hope the backups work, and go through that problem. Software. The other thing is there's no telemetry whatsoever. There's no snap packages installed. Instead, they go with Flatpak. Flatpaks are distro. They're not distro specific, so they work on any Linux distro, and they are supported out of the box. So if we go into Software Manager here, as you can see, we have one that says Flatpak. We can click on that, and these are all Flatpaks. So there's that. It's things like that that really make Linux Mint great. And this is inevitably why I gravitate towards Linux Mint. And if you're looking for a new Linux distro, I would highly recommend Linux Mint above anything else out there, especially with some of the features they're going to be adding. I'm looking forward to seeing what else they do besides the fractional scaling, if anything. That alone would be excellent. And overall, the problem with Linux Mint not being popular, in my opinion, is twofold. One, VPN companies that make a good GUI for Mac or Windows, and then they come to Linux and it's like, use the terminal. that kind of puts new users off, in my opinion. Um, Obviously, we don't need companies like Adobe. We have, our own versions and shit. Um, DaVinci Resolve does make a Linux version, and I would like to see them by default support more distros, honestly, or at least make a Flatpak. But we could use some more software developers putting their shit on here. I think that would greatly help out, especially games. The other problem is, yeah, having a lot of distros can be a good thing because it gives people more choice. It can also kind of hurt the cause, in my opinion, because you have so many people trying to come to Linux because Windows 10 fucking sucks, but they don't know what to choose because they're not familiar. And so they're gonna look to see what's recommended, or maybe distro hop or something like that. And it ultimately comes down to what's the most beginner friendly. And unfortunately, some of the things that I've seen kind of make it hard to recommend anything to new users. Ubuntu in general is terrible for new users, in my opinion, because it comes with GNOME. Anything with GNOME 3 is terrible for new users because of some of the problems that it has. You have to install Nautilus-admin to get that feature I just showed you in the file manager. You have to install a bunch of shit. If you put themes on it, it can break it. Mate looks too outdated, as I've said. There's just a lot of problems with a lot of desktop environments. And at the end of the day, whether you're a new user or someone who's lazy like me, simplicity will always win. And the fact that there's no telemetry or any of that shit, and everything is just done very well and it's very stable, will always be why I recommend Linux Mint. And I really want to see this distro do a lot better. And I think it's number 3 on Distro Watch right now. But I don't know why Manjaro scores higher, because to me Manjaro is a piece of shit. Not as a distro itself, but trying to install it. As I said, I can't use a USB stick, I have to use a DVD. I don't know how many people have those anymore either. The package manager is not very beginner friendly. Those are the main two things that made me say, okay, fuck Manjaro. And I think if they could fix that, it would be a lot more friendly to beginners. But the other problem is it's based off Arch, and Arch in general isn't very friendly to beginners. Whereas Debian, at least what I've seen, has the most amount of packages available. So it has the best software repos. And so anything based off that is going to do well. And while Ubuntu did do a lot well, they've done a lot of questionable shit. And Linux Mint basically comes in and basically took all the questionable shit out and just made a solid distro that works. So what Linux Mint ultimately is, yes, it's based off Ubuntu, but it's a much better, much more user-friendly version of Ubuntu. And I think that's where I'm going to end the video. So this has basically just been a rant on why I use Linux Mint and why I prefer to use Cinnamon above all other desktop environments. And I'll see you guys in the next video.